What's up guys, today I'm going to be reviewing the Holbrook Power Pro 14mm paddle. This is a $220 carbon fiber faced paddle, but it's probably one of the more unique paddles I've reviewed so far. Specifically because I think it tailors to a very specific audience, like ping pong players for instance. But I'll jump more into that in a bit. Anyways, please consider subscribing if you enjoy, and let's jump into the paddle itself. So specs wise, this is where things get interesting right off the bat. This paddle sits at a weight of around 7.8 ounces, which is one of the biggest factors in this paddle. This thing is noticeably light when you first pick it up. The other thing that's kind of unique about this paddle is it also has a slightly longer handle and a slightly smaller face, and it really gives it the illusion that this paddle is a lot smaller than it is. It's not, it's actually bigger than the Ruby and slightly smaller than an actual elongated paddle, but I actually kind of like it because it's that illusion that makes it feel even lighter, which is by far also the highlight and selling point of this paddle. Also, side note, this paddle also comes in colors other than pink too, if that's not your thing. And there's also different sizes and thicknesses as well. There's a 12mm and a 16mm version. Anyways, these are the rest of the specs if you want to pause, and now let's jump into the gameplay. Starting off with power, of course. So this paddle in general is pretty good when it comes to power. It isn't quite as powerful as I expected for a paddle with power in its name, but it's really not too bad, and it still hits decently hard. Now, the real place that this paddle separates itself from others is the swing weight, because it is so easy to effortlessly flick this thing for drives and power in general. While the max power of these drives may not be as strong as some of the other power paddles out there, the light weight of this paddle really allows you to drive or speed up pretty much any ball at any time. For example, on a ball that you have to back up into because it's too deep of a return or too deep of a serve, I feel way more comfortable still driving with this because I know I'm still able to generate enough power with it. And when it comes to just normal drives, I feel like because I don't have to focus as much on generating power, I can focus more on placement instead. Not to mention the fact that driving with this is just way less tiring than with a normal paddle, which in my opinion is a completely underrated perk. Driving a lot can be exhausting, and when you get tired, that's also when you tend to make more mistakes. Things like overheads also felt pretty good too. I wouldn't say it's anything special, but it definitely gets the job done. Overall for power though, I would give this a 7.5 out of 10 with an asterisk, because again, I don't think it hits as hard as some other paddles out there, but it's way easier to generate the power. Now moving on to pop. So let's just say that the pop on this paddle is not its strong suit. At the net, you really need to put more effort in to generate the spin and power you get from it, especially on volleys. But luckily, since it is really light in weight, it is really easy to maneuver it around, making it easy to put more force and power into the volleys to be more aggressive. It honestly kind of feels like using a ping pong paddle, because instead of pushing it, it feels a lot easier just to whip it around and try and get more power from flicking it. Which honestly, I mean, if that is your playstyle and you have a table tennis background, this paddle could be a perfect fit for you. Also, on a completely separate note, because this paddle is so light, it is exceptionally good for fast hand battles. It's just so easy to move this thing around that it definitely gives you the advantage in situations like those. But anyways, before I get too distracted, for sheer pop alone, I would give this a 5.5 out of 10. But it doesn't make this bad at the net either. It just means that you need to put in a bit more motion yourself to make up for the lack of pop. All right, on to control. Probably one of the expectedly weaker aspects of this paddle. So the control on it isn't terrible. Dinks felt pretty solid for the most part. It's not my favorite paddle to dink with, but I still felt fairly comfortable using it for that, which isn't always the case. The key is I never really ran into an issue with that part of the soft game. Drops, on the other hand, are where this paddle gets a little bit messy. Now, this thing is surprisingly plush, which is weird at first since it is a 14mm, but it also helped a lot with the control game. That said, it still took me a fair amount of time to get comfortable with drops on this. Eventually, I was able to get a lot more consistent and comfortable with it, but there is definitely a break-in period for control with this. You really have to have good touch in order to consistently drop the ball in, which that is not always the case with me. But overall, for control, I would give it a 5.5 out of 10. Okay, now on to spin. So right out of the box, this paddle was fairly gritty, but after a few solid weeks of playing with it non-stop, I have to say I can already feel the grit has worn down a lot. It's still there, but it is noticeably different. I remember it used to kind of hurt to drag my hand across it, but now I can kind of just do it without any issue whatsoever. That said, the spin you can generate with this paddle is still pretty good. I think a lot of that has to do with being able to flick it harder than other paddles, so you're able to generate a bit more spin, but overall I would probably give it a 6 out of 10 for spin. All right, sweet spot. So The sweet spot on this is pretty good until you use two hands, and here's my theory for that. Because this paddle is a bit on the thinner side, if you hold it too steady, it tends to flex back a bit and it makes your shots a bit more unpredictable. It's like if a basketball were to hit a dead spot on a gym floor instead of bouncing off of asphalt. It's just a lot more consistent to judge how hard something is going to bounce back with a harder surface than one that flexes a bit more. But if you just use one hand and follow through on pretty much everything, then I think that sweet spot is pretty solid for the most part. I will say that this paddle was a bit unusual in the sense that it felt like I hit dead spots more often than usual, but the dead spots I hit didn't feel as dead. It was still very playable. Anyways, for sweet spot, I would give this a 6.5 out of 10. All right, now let's talk about cons. For starters, because it has just a bit shorter of a face, to me, the paddle felt shorter, and even though it wasn't, I inevitably whiffed a lot of balls starting out just because I was used to a more elongated paddle. That said, it's more likely I just sucked and missed them because I was bad, but there was a part of me that felt like it was the paddle. I definitely got more used to it as I played more with it though. The handle it came with also felt a bit off to me. It wasn't too bad, but I did like it a bit more with an overgrip though. And there's of course the two-handed factor. Two hands don't feel amazing with this paddle because the paddle is a bit thinner with a smaller face, but you can still make it work if you need to. Also, the only other big con is probably the price. It is a $220 paddle. I do have a discount code for 15% off though, which is Daniel PB, and it brings the price down to $187, which is a lot better, but it is still on the pricier side. Anyways, let's get into some of the final thoughts. So overall, it is a pretty good paddle, but it may not be for everyone. I think this paddle is really good for a specific group of players, and that would specifically be table tennis players transitioning to pickleball. I truly think that ping pong players would love this paddle. That said, honestly, anyone looking for a lighter paddle who still wants to be able to hit fairly hard would also probably enjoy the Holbrook Power Pro. This really is the whippiest paddle I've played with so far, and that aspect alone makes it really fun to hit hard and play with. And like I said earlier, it's also really good in hands battles too, so if you feel like that's where you're struggling the most in your game, then this paddle could also be a good fit for you. One thing I also forgot to mention too, which was actually huge, was if you're struggling with one-handed backhand counters, this paddle was perfect for transitioning into them. Before, I would always use a heavier 16mm paddle, so it was a bit harder for me to be aggressive with one hand on the backhand counters or flicks, but ever since I've used this paddle, it is so light and maneuverable that it really makes it feel natural. Anyways, this paddle definitely isn't for everyone still, but like I mentioned earlier, it also does come in a 12mm and 16mm version as well, so if you like the paddle but just want more control or pop, then changing up or down on the thickness could also be the play. Anyways, if you did want to get this paddle, you can use my code DanielPB to get 15% off on their site too, but other than that, that is all I got. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.